So the Lincoln document that I'll be providing a close read on is actually a speech that Lincoln delivered to a number of Indian chiefs that visited the White House on March 27th, 1863. Chronologically, this happened in between the Emancipation Proclamation and the Gettysburg Address, two well-known Lincoln documents. And it was during the time when the Civil War was raging. To provide some additional historical context for this document, Lincoln himself admitted to have little experience dealing with Indians. He knew hardly any of them, although his grandfather had been killed by natives. He had served in a militia that had meant to fight in the Black Hawk War, but he never actually saw any action. So he really didn't have much experience with them. Even to Chief John Ross of the Cherokee Nation, Lincoln said, "Hey, I really don't know the treaty obligations that the federal government owes you," and he, of course, was consumed, as it was, by prosecuting and finishing the Civil War. So the speech here happens in the time or the context of some unrest on the frontier. And Lincoln would have to keep a number of federal soldiers stationed in the West to forestall and limit future Indian uprisings. This was due because in the summer of 1862, due to horrible mistreatment by federal agents, including a lack of food and supplies that had been promised to the Minnesota Sioux, that tribe began kind of a grassroots uprising in which they massacred white settlers, and it was the largest actual massacre of white settlers by any Indian group in the West. So after the uprising was put down, Lincoln actually showed that he was no Indian hater like many of his Republican colleagues were, particularly those in Minnesota. The government there in Minnesota rounded up 300 alleged perpetrators of rapes, pillages, murders, those kind of crimes, and hastily put them through a capital punishment trial, convicted them, and wanted authorization to execute. They sent the list of names to Lincoln. Lincoln refused to act so hastily, in fact paused and said who was really guilty of the worst crimes, which included rape, murder of women and children, and those were the ones where there were clear evidence for he actually had executed. The others were detained, imprisoned, or eventually released. So the fears of uprising on the frontier provide a little bit of context for what Lincoln's doing here. And also his own personal prejudices of white superiority that were very common in the time period, and those come through in this document as well. Lincoln will also encourage assimilation of the Native Americans into white society to kind of match white ways, and this is very common in this time period as well. So the letter starts, the speech starts rather, with this kind of address to the Indian chiefs. "You have all spoken of the strange sights you see here." Of course, Lincoln's addressing the Indian chiefs. "Among your pale-faced brethren, the very great number of people that you see, the big wigwams, the difference between our people and your own. But you have seen but a very small part of the pale-faced people. You may wonder when I tell you that there are people here, in this wigwam, now looking at you, who have come from other countries a great deal farther off than you have come." Well, clearly Lincoln is addressing previous remarks by the chiefs, who through translator had likely indicated that they were very impressed by the tall buildings in Washington, D.C. They were currently in the White House in the East Room. They were probably very impressed by those buildings, as well as the large number of white people that were milling around in this urban center. So that had impressed the chiefs, and Lincoln was going to use that as a springboard to make some suggestions to them to how they could assimilate, and possibly even to intimidate them to keep them from considering any uprisings in the future. So one of the other things I find interesting in this section is how Lincoln speaks in a bit of the pidgin-type English, pale-faced, wigwams, those kind of things. And so he's either trying to address and meet the Indians where they are in their language, or he's kind of conveying a tone of superiority, and it's just not entirely clear here. He continues, "We pale-faced people think that this world is a great round ball, and we have people here, the pale-faced family, who have come almost from the other side of it to represent their nations here and conduct their friendly intercourse or trade relations with us, as you have now come from your part of the round ball. This document is interesting because it includes some additional information provided by the people recording the speech, italicized here, that kind of gives some context and explanation as to what's happening. So here a globe was introduced and the president, laying his hand upon it, said, "One of our learned men will now explain to you our notions about this great ball and show you where you live." So Lincoln had introduced a globe to them, which would have then had probably a relatively accurate map, not completely so, but generally accurately speaking, map, and he would have been able to indicate whereabouts some of the countries that these immigrants were from, likely, Eastern or Western European countries, France, Great Britain, Ireland, Germany, those kind of locations. And then he also is going to show them where they are. Following this is an address or a part of the speech by a prominent professor of the time period, so records that here also in italics. So these aren't actually Lincoln's words. Professor Henry then gave the delegation a detailed and interesting explanation of the formation of the earth, showing how much of it was water and how much was land, and pointing out the countries with which we had intercourse or trade, diplomatic relations. He also showed them the position of Washington and that of their own country from which they had come. Then the president then said, "We have people now present from all parts of the globe, here and here and here." You can kind of visualize Lincoln's actually looking at the globe and pointing, to the locations, Ireland or wherever it would be. "There is a great difference between this pale-faced people and their red brethren," and Lincoln's now going to start to make some distinctions as to what he thinks the Native American groups should do, both as to numbers and the way in which they live. "We know not whether your own situation is best for your race, but this is what had made the difference in our way of living." So Lincoln's about to kind of reveal his attitudes about Native Americans, and that is that they should actually assimilate. They should adopt white ways and should sort of forsake their current economic style especially, and he'll explain that right here. So the pale-faced people are numerous and prosperous because they cultivate the earth, produce bread, and depend upon the products of the earth rather than wild game for subsistence. Now this reveals a couple of things. Lincoln is basically saying you need to give up your nomadic or semi-nomadic lifestyle, settle down and plant food into the ground from which you can harvest. If you do this, this will actually increase your population, make you more numerous like the white people. So that's what he's encouraging to them to do. This does, obviously reveal, lack of Lincoln's understanding of, the native culture and those kind of things. And of course, the Plains Indians had been agricultural prior to the arrival of the horse in the New World, in which they had become, semi-nomadic and actually chased the herds of buffalo across the plains. But he's really thinking that, hey, if you Native American tribes will adopt agriculture, that will really assist your development. He continues on with another very interesting observation that deserves some attention. So he says, "This is the chief reason of the difference, that of agriculture." Meaning, that's the chief reason. The white people are agricultural and you are nomadic natives, so that's what the chief difference. "But there is another. Although we are now engaged in a great war between one another, we are not, as a race, so much disposed to fight and kill one another as our red brethren." This is an interesting point. I think Lincoln here was trying to justify the Civil War in some manner. So here the U.S. is in a war where already hundreds of thousands of Americans have died and perished, and he makes a kind of audacious claim and says, hey, you guys actually fight each other more than we do. And that to me is Lincoln really trying to actually keep the natives from actually doing anything further on the frontier. And I think that's really probably the best reading of it. But it is very interesting and also a bit outlandish on his part to make such a claim. He continues where he gives kind of a piece of advice without giving advice. So he says, "You have asked for my advice. I really am not capable of advising you, whether in the providence of the Great Spirit, who is the great Father of us all, it is best for you to maintain the habits and customs of your race or adopt a new mode of life." So here he's saying, I can't give you advice, but he really does in the next sentence. "I can only say that I can see no way in which your race is to become as numerous, as prosperous as the white race, except by living as they do, by the cultivation of the earth." So Lincoln is kind of giving advice without giving advice, saying he's not, but he really is. And it says, you really need to assimilate, you need to change your lifestyle, and that'll really allow you to prosper like the white race. And of course, this does show superiority, a white superiority view of Lincoln towards Native Americans, which would have been a very common prejudice of the time. Finally, Lincoln tries even further to convince these chiefs to not do anything on the frontier. It is the object of this government to be on terms of peace with you and with all our red brethren. So Lincoln makes that blanket statement. We constantly endeavor to be so. We make treaties with you, which the federal government had done many times, and will try to observe them. I think try is an interesting and key term there. And if our children should sometimes behave badly and violate these treaties, it is against our wish. It is not always possible for any father to have his children do precisely as he wishes them to do. Lincoln chose the word try because, of course, the federal government and many white settlers and state and local governments have been guilty of breaking the treaties that they had made. The federal government, by law, was the only institution that could actually make formal treaties with Native American tribes. But the white settlers often broke those treaties, invaded land that had been promised to Native Americans. And Lincoln here is not promising that he's going to stop that process at all. In fact, he basically says, sometimes kids misbehave. What he fails to do is extend this metaphor of the federal government as a father and settlers as children all the way to its logical conclusion. Clearly, the federal government, if it had made a treaty, would have been tasked to keep that treaty and to enforce that for its white settlers, something that Lincoln clearly here is not so willing to do. He is hoping, I think, that by saying some of these things, it will at least limit white and Indian conflict on the frontier. He concludes by getting their travel arrangements. In regard to being sent back to your own country, we have an officer, the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, who will take charge of that matter and make the necessary arrangements. This document concludes with another explanation of what else was going on that I think is worth investigating. It says the President's remarks were received with frequent marks of applause and approbation or support. Ugh, aha, sounded along the line as the interpreter proceeded, and their countenances gave evident tokens of satisfaction. As a historian, I question just a little bit what's stated here. These Indian chiefs were well out of their element in a very unfamiliar place. Soldiers all around Washington, D.C., themselves hearing through a translator. There's a lot to suggest that it would be hard to imagine any leader in such an environment questioning or challenging or becoming irate by what the speaker was saying, especially since Lincoln's words here are pretty conciliatory. And while promising little, he's not, being confrontational or warlike or anything towards these Indian chiefs. And so it would make sense for them to respond in this way, but I don't know that necessarily means that they assented or agreed with what he said. So this document is fascinating to me because it gives us a chance to look at the other Lincoln that we don't think about a lot. The Lincoln who was a commander-in-chief, who had to deal with Indian problems, who had other things beyond just the Civil War that he had to consider. And I think that gives kind of a perspective of him as a leader that we don't often see. While Lincoln apparently would have liked to stop further uprisings and massacres on the frontier, that hope was to be in vain. Indians fought on both sides, both Confederate and Union, and were big parts of the war. And the West, like soldiers, were stationed out there for the whole time to try to forestall and limit any uprisings. In the end, they failed in some cases as there were massacres in different locations.